Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Authentic Uprising Podcast. I'm your host, Jill Simons, and I'm so excited to grow in the radical art of standing in what God says about you with you today. The show is a place where we pour into the sense of who God is, who we are, and how we can live more in the freedom that He has for us every single day. Hello, and welcome to the Authentic Uprising Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Jill Simons, and I'm so happy to see you every single week. I have a wonderful guest to chat with today that I'm just so excited to share with you. Her name is Tasha Wilson, and she is a coach and an author and a speaker who shares really from this place of personal experience about self-worth and the importance of putting self-worth in its proper place in our lives, which is allowing God to really determine and speak into our self-worth so that we can be actually humble, so that we can actually forget about ourselves and move forward in doing the work of loving other people well and loving God well. But we can only do that when we're stable in and of ourselves. So thank you, Tasha, so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I am really excited for today's conversation.
So Tasha, why don't you share with us a little bit about how you got into this coaching and speaking space, specifically around this topic of self-worth?
Yeah, so it's funny because I always tell everyone that it wasn't something I necessarily sought out. It was something that found me. And what I mean by that is I experienced tragedy and I experienced trauma. And it kind of goes back to where we think about how God works all things together for our good. And so in hindsight, I was at the lowest moment of my life. I had lost my father unexpectedly at the age of 16. And then me going to school was my way of escape to not be consumed by that lingering identity as, okay, that's the girl whose father, passed away. And so going to school, I'm like, okay, I'm going to create a new narrative for myself where no one knows my backstory. And no one knows everything that comes with me. And then here we are at the age of 18, I'm sexually assaulted. And so for me, I realized that I can run from things, but they're always going to catch up with me if I don't address them. And so it was after the sexual assault that I really hit rock bottom with having that inner struggle of loving who I am, loving who God created me to be, and recognizing my worth. And so I hid from mirrors. I had the thoughts of the enemy telling me that I wasn't good enough, telling me I wasn't worthy of love, telling me my life no longer had value. And I believed them. I believed them for such a long time that I allowed it to show up in my decision making when it came to romantic relationships, friendships, even in my faith and my confidence and belief in God. It was just the moment where I just kind of shut everything out and just kind of retreated and isolated myself from the world. So it was that turning point for me that I actually discovered my God-given purpose. And so it's so funny because, sometimes people kind of have these flowery stories of, how they became the person that they are today or who they're continually becoming. But for me, it actually was quite the opposite.
Yeah. My heart breaks for you having gone through those experiences, but I also just feel so compelled to honor what the Lord did in those situations where we really see the faithfulness in the fact that He does bring, all things together for good for those that love Him, even these things that are just senseless, horrifying, no one should experience ever, are not outside of His grasp to draw back in, to be the vehicle for us ultimately discovering our identity, like you were talking about, and really like what the context of our life actually is, which of course is relationship with Him. And so I want to just affirm you in sharing this story, because I know that this story is shared by heartbreakingly many people. And I know that there are people listening that are where you were when that happened. And so I just encourage those people to look at Tasha and to just really take her words from here on out to heart, because they are hard won.
Yeah. Yeah. There is a way out of it. Sometimes we don't see the other side when we're in the middle of it, but trust and believe. There is beauty in the brokenness, and there is an overcomer within you. I always look at myself as a champion, because a lot of times people ask me, why didn't you crumble, or why didn't you just fall apart? But that's the importance of when God has his hand on your life, even when it seems unbearable. He's with you the whole time. And, even when you feel like he's not present, he is. When things really don't make sense, he's like, okay, I'm going to bring clarity for you. And, now in my life, I see why a lot of it made sense. Because prior to these experiences, I've always hid who I was. I didn't like the fact that I was a leader. I didn't like the fact that, God would call me forth to do things. And so it was just easier for me to kind of, encourage other people to do things. And honestly, it was these experiences that I found the value of my voice. I found the power and the encouragement within to say, okay, God, I see what you've been doing all along. And so even though it was an unconventional process and journey, it all makes sense, because what I've experienced in dealing with trying to understand my emotions and trying to process everything that was going on, I then knew that I had to share my story to help someone else out. I then knew that I didn't want anyone to feel like I did. I didn't want anyone to feel like their life was meaningless. I didn't want anyone to feel like their life was hopeless. And so I knew that once God had redeemed me and restored me, that I had to share my experience as a testimony. I had to encourage other people out there that what you're dealing with now is not the end all be all, and that there is freedom when you truly allow God into your heart. You truly allow God to change the way that you think, and then you ultimately allow him in your life. And for me, really understanding that what he said in his word is manifesting in my life, to say, okay, my concept of self is nothing in comparison to how he's always viewed me. And so I think that's really important to know that your experience is not your identity. It's just a part of your journey, a part of your process to really allow you to become who he has always ordained you to be.
Oh my goodness, there's so many things I want to respond to in what you just said. It was all so good. But I love, especially what you said. I love all of it, but I love what you said about your experience being the basis of your identity. I think that's what we default to. Yeah. So organically, it's just, this is how I've always thought about myself. This is how other people have always treated me. So this must be who I am. And there really is an incredible amount of strength in saying, in really laying down, like, this is what I feel I have evidence for, but I'm going to lay that down in obedience to God. And I'm going to pick up what he says instead. And that can be something that, for me personally, I've had times where I'm just like crying and just like, Lord, it's too hard. Like, I just, it is so much easier to just collapse into this feeling of like, well, I'm worthless, like, and just kind of wallow there, because it requires a lot less effort and strength on my part versus exerting our will, which I think is so much a part of the conversation that doesn't get looped in sometimes, is how God really honors our free will. And when we pick up those lies and let those be the basis of our identity, he lets us, not because he doesn't love us, but because he respects our autonomy. And so he's not going to rip them out of our hands and say, no, here, take this. This is what I say about you. We have to lay them down, and we have to pick up what it is that he says about us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And for a long time, I allowed self-sabotage to get in the way, because, like you said, it's just so much easier to succumb to what we've always thought about ourselves. takes a lot of work to really unlearn, certain behaviors and mindsets. And, when we feel that pressure, we're like, we can't do it. And, it's like, but you can't, right? If we allow ourselves to relinquish the control, it's a lot easier to just yield. Even now, I'm like, okay, especially if you're someone who's very assertive, or you're someone who can come off, with doing things on your own, and a lot of times it could be, maybe you don't have a lot of consistent friends or a family member. So you just kind of are accustomed to doing things on your own independently. But God is like, I didn't ask you to carry this on your own. I didn't tell you that you needed to do this by yourself. It really allows you to trust and place your confidence in Him. And so having that consistent challenge of, okay, is this Tasha doing her own thing? Or is this really listening to what God is saying and doing what He wants me to do? And so for me, it's always that reminder of, Tasha, you don't have to do this. Who told you to carry this? And resorting to what's familiar instead of just, having that belief, that confidence that when you do things unexpected, like a supernatural blessing will come out of it. And so for me, it's like, okay, what's the worst that can happen if you step out on faith? What's the worst that could happen if you really trust what God is showing you and really take that path instead of trying to create your own? And so I just think it's really important to understand that it could be an ongoing battle, but give yourself grace. A lot of times, when we continually have that same inner struggle, it's just reminding ourselves that we're human and we can't do it on our own. Yeah, I think sometimes we don't give ourselves enough credit, or we feel like I should have passed this test already. Why is it taking so long? But ultimately, it's just a reminder that we always need God no matter what.
Absolutely. We don't take that grace that He extends to us. Like, He is not there. Like, why isn't this done now? We're the ones that are saying, why isn't this done now? And so on a practical level, as you move through this really strong transition from being in this very low self-worth place to moving to more of where you are now, which, as we talked about before we jumped on the call, is always a process and not an arrival. What does it look like on a practical level? Like, what tools have you used to move from point A to point B?
Yeah. So on a practical level, it really started with me affirming myself, even when it sounded strange. You get up and you say, for me, it had to start being comfortable with looking in the mirror again, because, that was something that I ran from because of what happened. And so really facing myself. And so for me, it's looking in the mirror and saying, Tasha, you are royalty. Tasha, you are loved. Tasha, you are valuable. Tasha, you are cherished. And at the beginning, it was really weird because to say those words out loud, you're like, okay, like we can always have these thoughts sometimes, or other people can tell us. But when you say it to yourself, it's just a brand new awakening. And so for me, at the very beginning, it was so strange, but I continued to say it until I started believing it. And so, I exercised it like a muscle. Like if you're in the gym and you're working out and you're like, okay, after a while you see the results. It was the same thing with my mind. If I continue to say this and I continue to say them out loud and I'm consistent with saying it, I'm going to believe it. And so once I start believing it, I'm actually going to show up as that. And so for me, that was the initial step and really affirming myself and not really relying on other people to do it. I think, sometimes we get so caught up in what other people say about us that it then impacts who we are day to day. So I had to understand, that my language had to match what God was saying. And so that for me is kind of started the journey of it all, is really affirming myself verbally. Next step I did was I have an affirmation wall. It's filled with scripture. It's filled with positive quotes. I'm a huge person who shops in home goods. And so I get those canvas prints on my wall, but I have it in an area that I can't miss it. And so for me, it's like before I exit my door to start my day, that's the last thing I see. And so, sitting there and watching it, um, is something that kind of keeps me grounded to say, okay, I can conquer the day. I can do this. Another tangible tip is that I have reminders in my phone. So, how sometimes you have calendar alerts. I use the word of God, scripture, to kind of remind me. So even if I have a bad moment, it's like, okay, here's the word of God to really uplift me and to change my mood, to really remind me of who I am. And it's small things like that, because I'm just really big on the power of words, because I was so used to tearing myself down and believing that I had to change what I used to do and do something new. And so for others, it could be doing something different as far as showing up for yourself in the way of treating yourself to your favorite meal, doing things that you actually love. Surround yourself by people who really love you and not judge you. It's all about what your love language is. I think it's really important to know what your top love languages are and how you can put that in action in your life.
Absolutely. I think that that's a really powerful way to think about it, that we don't often, we talk about, our spouse's love language or our children's love language, but thinking about what it is for yourself and feeding yourself that. And so I'd love for you to speak to, because I feel listeners right now being like, oh, but it's selfish, and oh, but it's about me. And how is that fit in my context of relationship with God? And you and I know that that's not the truth. So I'd love for you to speak to why that is not the truth.
Yeah. Again, I could relate. As a giver, you're so used to giving yourself, your time, your resources, your energy to everyone else, that you feel like it's selfish when you do that with taking the time for you. And honestly, it's not true. It's far from the truth. One thing I have to remind myself, and I'll remind you all, is that how can you fully give yourself to someone else if you're not doing that within yourself? You are your first investment. You are a top priority. And, the way that I say, I cannot honor God with my best if I'm depleted. I cannot fully give who He has created me to be if I'm not taking the time for self-care. It's not selfish at all. God wants you whole, so you can't give parts of you to someone, or parts of you to your job, or parts of you to ministry if you are not where you're supposed to be. Taking that time out, being intentional. Like I say, self-care means really spending time with God, being in His presence. That is not selfish at all. He wants uninterrupted time with you. And so that could look like having worship music in the background, journaling your prayers, your thoughts to God, your concerns to God, your prayer requests. But He really wants you to take that time, because when you really take that time to focus on you, you learn more about yourself. You really learn more about that intimacy with God. And that's what His biggest desire is. When we learn more about who we are, who we're becoming, we then now know how to pour into other people. So don't ever feel selfish to take that time for yourself. It may be a hard thing to do at first, but with practice, it will become more natural when you implement that in your routine. And again, give yourself grace. You won't figure it out, all at one time, but just don't let a disruption to delay the process of you becoming the best version of yourself.
Absolutely. And I think that it's so important, like you mentioned, intention. There's absolutely a way to do self-care where it's like very self-focused and is very selfish, where it's very turned inward. Yeah. And I am going to create my best self under my own power and very all me, as opposed to what Tasha and I are talking about, which is this, what does it look like for me to really respond to and be formed into the person that God desired me to be? And so it really is, again, about exerting our will in submission and surrender to that thing, because and this is what I use to call myself back to these kind of practices when I slip, is I always ask myself, am I giving Jesus everything he paid for?
That
Because
is so good.
yes, because I'm like, he did not, he came for me to have access to heaven, of course, but it's not just, all of this is awful until I die. And then we get to the good part with God. God is present to us now because of Christ, because he came and opened that access to the Father that we all have, that used to be exclusive to the prophets. And now that we all have that, living in less than the fullness of that is living in less than what Jesus came for.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree even more. It's like when you put it in that perspective to say, okay, I want to give God all of me. It's not being selfish. It's not.
Absolutely.
It's not.
That's a hard thing to rewire, though.
Yes, it is. It is because, a lot of times the way self-care is presented, it's coming from a superficial lens, from very surface foundation, fundamentally. A lot of times like social media, they're like, okay, self-care is, getting your nails done, really locking yourself in the bathroom and taking, 10, 15 minutes away from everyone. But we have to understand that it's how you frame it. And it's honestly what you need that self-care for. If it's for rejuvenating your mind or restoring or, putting yourself back into recenter mode, then you have to be intentional with what that self-care looks like and the why behind your self-care. If it's just more so, I just need a moment to separate and isolate myself from everyone, then you're not really utilizing the fullness of what self-care is. But if it's something that allows you to become better or allows you to become more beneficial, then that's the whole point of self-care. It's really putting that priority of loving on you, really taking the time to understand how valuable you really are. And that's what self-care is. When you look at it from the biblical standpoint, it's more so like, okay, God, I've been doing everything else for everyone else. And I have not took the time to ask you what you need of me. I have not took the time to really spend time with you and make you the priority. Because when you are really operating from the standpoint of my life is to please God, you won't feel empty. It's one of those where you're just trying to do things out of your own strength and you're overextending yourself and you're not understanding boundaries because you're choosing how to live instead of really picking up your cross to say, okay, God, how is my life a reflection of you? How am I being a disciple in the earth? How is my light being an opportunity for hope and freedom for other people? And so really taking that nature of it and flipping it, I think that'll make it a little more easier for us to start implementing self-care in our day-to-day.
And that's such a good place to bring in the virtues, like talking about pride versus humility in this context, because I think that this is another place people get tripped up, is feeling like they switch which one is connected to which thing. And so often we live these frantic lives out of our own power, thinking that that's humility, when actually that's pride. Say, I'm going to do all this. Whereas it's the humble thing to realize that you need to rest and that you need to be refilled. And it also allows you to enter this place really of self-forgetfulness, because you're not going around depleted, like you were saying. You are actually topped off for what you need to do, so that when these opportunities do arise to do what the Lord is calling you to do, you are able to say, yes, okay, I'm good, and not need something from that experience or from that person that you're helping, because you're good. Your identity is set. You have been filled in the way that you needed to be filled. And we see this reflected very concretely in the 10 Commandments, in the commandment to honor the Sabbath, to not push through that, to actually take that day that the Lord didn't need to take, but he took to show us what we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just interesting because right now, society pushes the agenda of the culture of busyness. And so it kind of makes you feel bad or feel guilty when you take that time to rest. And so for us, it's about discerning the voices that we hear and the things that we see. Knowing that when you are an ambassador of Christ, your life is going to look different anyway. It's not going to make sense to everyone, but it ultimately makes sense to him. And so it's really discerning what's impactful or what's influential, right? And so when it comes to the busyness culture, it's just saying, oh, we need you to be an influencer. We need you to do this or we need you to do that. But what tone are you really setting behind your actions? And so it's always how you can kind of sift out the difference of those who really want to make an impact or really want to leave a legacy behind versus those who are just kind of doing what's current or what's trendy. And so, I think that also separates the pride and humility as well, because a lot of people, when you kind of see their why or their driving force, because your why is going to keep you going, even on days you don't feel like it, even on days you may feel that you're unworthy to answer the call. But your why is that reminder of God chose you, he trusted you with it. And so now you just got to go ahead and do it. Right. Versus, I'm just doing things because it's trendy. That'll die off. Eventually it'll fade. And so one thing, being a Christian is understanding that sometimes you may not get the results immediately, but you know that throughout it all, it's worth it. And it's all about making sure that you're planting the seeds and for the audience or the people that God has called you for. And it's okay, knowing that sometimes you look at others and you're comparing their journey, like, okay, how come it's happening for them right now and not necessarily me? When it talks about the whole self-worth thing, you have to understand that your experience and your journey is personal. And, the way that you are moving through it is for a reason. Like, don't compare your timeline to anyone else. Also, don't compare your experience to someone else, right? Because even though we may have walked similar paths with others, it's still tailor-made for you. There's still something out of it that God wants you to show and encourage and empower other people with. And so really understand and cherish that. I think that really helps us to say, okay, I can do this, I can conquer this because, whatever experience or whatever life has handed me, it's for a greater purpose.
Absolutely. In the entrepreneurial world, and you may have come across this, Tasha, in your work as well, we always talk about mission drift.
Yeah.
When people start burning out, it's because they have mission drift where they've lost sight really of that why, like you were saying, of like, what is it that we are trying to accomplish here? Mm-hmm. And this happens in our lives as Christians all the time as well, where we have this drift of really, what is going on here? Where do I fall in, the whole story, essentially? Because I think so often we take ourselves out of the context of Christ, out of that context of that childhood in the family of God, and put ourselves in these servant, slave type positions, even within the context of being in relationship with God, because we're more comfortable with, like, let me try and earn this versus just receiving it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, we feel sometimes we treat God like we treat people. It's like we feel like we have to earn certain things, or we operate from like a checklist standpoint. And God is like, I just need you. I just need your willingness. I just need you to be open. That's it. It's like, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm not asking you to have all of this stuff together. I just need you to show up. That's it. And I think, when we get so accustomed to trying to earn love from family members, loved ones, your partner, whatever, right? We kind of match that to our relationship with God. And, one thing you have to understand is that you are enough. Like, there's nothing around it, right? Knowing that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. It's like, you're not a mistake. God already knows everything about you. Like, so your experiences are not a surprise at all, at all. And so it's just really having the confidence in that and knowing that. I think that will also help too, when it comes to really learning how to love yourself or relearning how to love yourself and really understanding that your worth is not measured by a checklist.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a hot button phrase you use, that you are enough, in the Christian community. And there's constantly like the war about that phrase. Like, should we say that? Should we not? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's one of those things that, like so many, the truth is in the middle, where it's not, we're not enough out of the context of God, but we are enough in the context of God. And that's why I think inherently from the Christian viewpoint, it is a good thing to say, because when you have put yourself in the context of relationship with God, these things, the things that you said to yourself in the mirror, Tasha, as you were going through this process, are things that you're not thinking new thoughts about yourself. These are things God has already spoken over you. Yeah. And speaking them again over yourself. And you mentioned kind of the laundry list of people that we try and earn love from. And I would add that we try and earn love from ourselves by really being the way, getting the job, making the money, having the relationship, whatever the situation is, and letting instead God saying that we are lovable be enough for us to love ourselves. That is a new horizon for a lot of people.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, it's so funny because after you experience trauma, it's like you try to prove to yourself that I'm no longer that, right? I'm not longer who I used to be or what I believe. That you start looking at these things, like you said, I have to earn this certain amount of a salary. I have to get this type of job, or I have to present myself drastically different than what people may have known me as. And it's kind of like, whose standards are you really trying to measure up to? And, like I said, I was someone who would purposely self-sabotage things, and it's kind of like, all right, are we now operating from a place of pride, or we're operating from a place of purpose? And so really making sure that with that intentionality in your decisions, what is the seed that you're watering when it comes to these decisions? And so when you are so caught up with trauma, you really can allow that to navigate what your future may look like if you're not careful. And so that's why, for me, I make it a standard practice to say, okay, God, how can I please you today? How do you want me to show up today? Because that way I'm now removing myself out of the equation on what I think I need to do to get the acceptance from others.
That's very powerful. Absolutely. I think that that's an important part of any morning routine, to really let it be clear whose hands things are in, because really that's the ultimate expression of pride, is to continue in the illusion that it's in our hands.
Yeah.
And when we just chop that off at the root at the beginning of the day, that's a pretty solid way to start it.
Yes. Yeah. Because sometimes, pride is so subtle. It can be very sneaky, on how it creeps in. And sometimes we're not even aware it's pride until something falls through the cracks and we're like, ooh, okay, I shouldn't have done this anyway. It's usually the afterthought, like, ooh, this was definitely a me thing and not a God thing. And so to eliminate that or try to avoid it as much as possible, it's just always good to start off your day that way. Like, learn from me, doing things your way is not always best. It'll take you the scenic route of handling things or learning things about yourself, instead of just saying, I surrender. And again, surrender can seem uncomfortable, especially if you're someone who's been trying to control things yourself. And again, that's another traumatic response. Like, after something as traumatic as a sexual assault happens, you feel like you have to learn how to now control your life or that narrative, because that was something that was stripped away from you. And so really understanding that dynamic with your relationship with God is it's not a power struggle. It's not anything that determines, okay, I need to prove this or I need to do that. But really understanding that in your relationship with God is honestly where you'll feel the most free. And it releases you from that shackle of feeling like you have something to prove. And so again, it's something that is a constant thing. So, when it comes to dealing with healing, don't think that it's a one-time event. It is a journey. It is a lifelong journey. And it's something that you continually have to work on. And, I tell people all the time that when you are continually working on your healing, it also shows that you are also human. I think sometimes we try to dehumanize ourselves from our experiences or our past. And we have to learn how to not be ashamed or embarrassed by it. Because when you show up as who you've always been called to be, that means everything, the complete package. So that's the things that you may not be so proud of, the things that you are proud of, but that's a part of your story for a reason. So don't run from it.
Absolutely. And I think that that's really, again, the humble thing is to step into the healing that the Lord invites us into. And like you said, it's a gentle thing when the Lord is leading the process. And so therefore it's a lengthy one. It's not typically something that's a quick and easy fix. But I pray for inner healing with people frequently. And I've had people before say, it sounds so weird to say, but I'm almost thankful for these things that have happened because of the way that this has allowed me to experience the love of the Lord in having him come in and heal those things. Yes. And I think that that's just another toxic, sneaky place where pride lives, is this, oh, well, I'm the only one that God doesn't love because of this sin or because of this thing that happened to me or whatever the case might be, because that allows us to, again, stay in a place that feels safe as opposed to the vulnerability of actually allowing him into these open wounds. You think about, doing surgery on a broken bone or something like that. Not a pleasant experience, but also incredibly necessary. And we would think someone was crazy if they're walking around with a broken leg, unwilling to go to the doctor because they say, well, this can't be healed. And yet we so often do that with these wounds from trauma, these wounds from, what laundry list of mental and emotional things that people have gone through, that the Lord is really saying, okay, but remember, I'm the divine physician. I'm the healer. Look at what I did during my life on earth. And we know from Revelations where it says that the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. If he healed people when he was here, he wants to heal again. And that means he wants to heal you.
Yes, absolutely. And, for me, I had to come to terms with understanding that pain wasn't necessarily my enemy. It was my ally. Like, I would not be able to understand anything about healing if I didn't experience pain. Because, sometimes we always ask, why is this happening to me? Or what is the significance of this? But it's like joy and freedom, right? You don't understand the totality of joy if you have never experienced hurt. And so it just really those teachable moments. For me, because for me, if it wasn't for pain, then I really wouldn't understand purpose. I really wouldn't understand the value of my voice. I really wouldn't understand really who God is allowing me to become. And, usually when it's pain happening, we try to figure out, how can we just fix this? How can we just handle this? How can we just, get over it? But it's really something that God wants us to deal with, because, if we don't necessarily deal with it, whatever that pain is, it's going to follow us for the rest of our lives. And so, like you said, when he creates that invitation for us to enter into healing, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. And for us, it's like, we're not as open to that invitation unless we're like, okay, I had to experience something that didn't quite feel so good, or I had to face something that I didn't think that I would ever have to face. And, I always tell people all the time, it may hurt right now, but that's for right now, and understanding that it's now going to contribute to something else that's going to feel even greater once you start dealing with it. There's no way around it, and so it's very important to, even when you feel like you can't deal with it by yourself, have the right people. And if you don't have the right people in your life, ask God to send them, because we are built for community. And so I think that's something that we often neglect when it comes to the healing process. We just feel like we have to hide it or do it in secrecy. And that's not the case. You have no idea how what you're dealing with somebody else could have dealt with, or, have been in your shoes, and really understand. And the importance of the healing journey also is to help you recognize patience. We always view patience as punishment, and it's not. Patience really gives us the endurance that we need to also not provide that sense of security for us, but then also that empathy that we can give others when they're going through something.
Absolutely. I feel like we could talk about this all day, Tasha. This is so much here and such good information. But I'm so thankful for your time today. And we have links to where you can connect with Tasha in our show notes. But if you want to tell us verbally, Tasha, where people can connect with you and what else it is that you offer, I would love to give you space to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the easiest way is my website, www.lifewithtashaw.com. That's a way where you can kind of get more background information about me, my story, connect with me as far as either wanting to be involved with my coaching program, which is called Unmasking the Inner Me. Also being able to reach out and say, hey, want to collaborate? I'm having an event coming up. I would love for you to come speak, those type of things. Also, social media, Facebook, I have a group. It's called Tasha W. Messenger of Hope. It's where I kind of give information that you could use for inspiration, encouragement, and then also my Instagram account, which is lifewithtashaw_.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today, Tasha. It was such a joy.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the Authentic Uprising podcast. It is always a joy to be with you. I encourage you to subscribe to our podcast, subscribe to our YouTube channel, whichever place you most prefer, or do it all if that is what floats your boat. We would love to continue to get to know you better and grow in relationship with you. And so I encourage you to check out the links in both our show notes and our YouTube description that tell you more about where you can connect with us elsewhere. The two big things we have going on besides the podcast is our shop that is full of reminders of who you are in God, helping you to really grow in that radical art of standing in who you are and giving gifts that help others to do the same. The other big thing we have going on is the Uprising Academy. This is all of our formation programs, workshops, retreats. Everything is available virtually and on demand, where you can sign up and continue to learn more about radically standing in what God says about you, especially if you are in a place in your life where you are not being fed the way that you long to be fed. Whether it's in your community, whether it's at your church, whatever it is, there is more for you, and we can absolutely walk with you into it through the Uprising Academy. All those links are in our show notes, and if you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to leave a review. Reviews are the number one way that we help get in front of new faces, new people that are able to be touched by the radical art of standing in what God says about us. I love you. I'm praying for you. I hope you have an amazing week.